If you've played any RPG before, I'm sure you're well aware with the concept that your journey begins at character creation. And if you're anything like me, that character creation will easily take multiple hours. Pillars of Eternity 2 is certainly no exception to this rule. Ultimately, you are working with a party of up to 5 different characters, but knowing how to build those characters, especially your main character, is very helpful if you want to traverse across the harder difficulties. So with that in mind, here's a basics guide for character creation in Pillars of Eternity 2, where I'll go over specific mechanics and combinations you should keep in mind when building a character. Starting with the various races, races are far less important for your character's effectiveness than they ever were in Pillars of Eternity 1. In short, absolutely pick whatever you feel like for role-playing purposes, but nevertheless, here's how they do in the power scale. Island Amua get a very specific immunity to terrain impediments. These terrain effects are rather far and few between, meaning this is indeed a very specific racial, but can actually be quite useful as a lot of the situationally harder fights can be found in these zones. If you're making a damage-dealing melee character, this isn't too shabby to go with, albeit extremely situational. Coastal Amua get a resistance to Might Afflictions. I've gone over these specific mechanics in my combat mechanics guide, so if the concept of an affliction or resistance confuses you, you might want to check that out too, but nevertheless, all of these resistances are fantastic to have as they protect you from debuffs, in this case Might debuffs, and downgrade them to the previous tier, meaning that a resistance prevents a character from ever being hit by a tier 3 debuff of that attribute. Might debuffs are particularly nasty if you rely on this character for engagement, i.e. a tank, as all Might debuffs break engagement, so for those characters this can be a nice shield especially, and for everyone else, not being able to get stunned is an amazing defensive passive. Boreal Dwarves have possibly the worst ratio in the game, a very specific and small increase to primordial type enemies only, and are frankly not a race I would recommend as such. Mountain Dwarves have resistance to Constitution afflictions, which notably reduce healing taken, so again, in the case of a tank, these are particularly good, but certainly excellent for everyone. Pill Elves have once more an extremely situational ratio, but quite a good one in those moments. 4 more armor rating versus Burn and Freeze, which is quite good for anyone, as these tend to come in the form of area of effect attacks, albeit this ratio will of course do nothing outside of those moments. That said, 4 is quite a lot of armor. Wood Elves have resistance to Dexterity afflictions, which is generally more relevant for melee characters than ranged characters, although this includes Paralyzed, which is a massive debuff that gives enemies a huge chance to do critical hits, so once more, a great shield for about anyone. Humans gain increased accuracy when they are at half HP or less, which in particular works out quite well for a Street Fighter rogue, though for most other characters this won't be very relevant. Not too bad to pick up on a tanky character that also focuses on damage output. Wild Orlan get resistance to Resolve afflictions, which in particular lower your power level, and Frighten prevents ability usage entirely, making these especially useful for casters, albeit again a good shield for anyone. Half Orlan get a small conversion from hits to crits when targeting something an ally is already attacking. Now, hugely important is to keep in mind that these conversions don't stack and have diminishing returns. For instance, if you have 25% hit to crit, that means another 20% hit to crit will only be 15% in actuality. So in short, stacking more of these is ineffective, making this in particular worse for rogues and fighters, which already have great access to these conversions. Honestly, because you likely already have pretty good access to these conversions as the game goes on, for instance, any character that can do Paralyze will give this to your party, this ratio is ultimately not that good. And finally, we get to the most min-max race of all, the Godlike. Keep in mind that playing a Godlike means you forfeit the use of a helmet, which does lower your fashion sense. Dev Godlike gain increased damage against characters on 25% HP or less, which is generally a solid ratio for damage dealers, but especially useful for characters that gain benefits when they deal the killing blows, such as Paladins inspiring Triumph Talent or Barbarians with Bloodlust. The second part from Godlike is less relevant in most cases, they gain increased power level when near death. Power level doesn't really work as well for characters like the Paladin or Barbarian, so this part instantly becomes relatively irrelevant, except for the most niche of builds. Fire Godlike gain a single point of armor when they are on 50% HP or less and will lash out to deal a very small amount of burn damage to attackers. This is only useful for tank characters, and even then 1 point of armor isn't that huge, but nevertheless it isn't bad either. And secondly, they gain 2 burn armor rating baseline. Moon Godlike are a lot weaker than in Pillars of Eternity 1, but nevertheless aren't bad at all. They deal a small AoE healing wave that baseline heals for 10 around themselves whenever they drop to 75%, 50%, and 25% HP, meaning you'll have 3 waves of healing per combat. This ratio is especially useful for tanks as such, and does scale with might. And finally, Nature Godlike have increased power level by 2 whenever they have a Might, Dexterity, or Constitution inspiration, which is incredible for casters in particular, and as a result make some of the best casters in the game, or anything that heavily relies on power level. Another thing to keep in mind with these races, from a min-max perspective, is that races that give perception or dexterity, so elves, godlike or Orlan, can be min-maxed slightly easier because these two attributes in particular are quite strong. So let's go over attributes first, and then we'll swing back to classes in the end. Might. Might increases healing done and damage dealt in addition to the fortitude defense. Now for damage specifically, might isn't necessarily right. At Might 20, you are increasing your damage by a mere 30%. However, the game has a plethora of damage increases that match or heavily outclass that 30%. Sneak attack from rogues, for instance, already does plus 30%. Biting whip from a Cipher also increases damage by 20%. These are baseline increases these classes get regardless. Ultimately, high might is a heavy point investment for something that one piece of gear is probably going to do equally, if not better. Exceptional weapons, for instance, gain plus 30% damage, in addition to penetration and other statistics. You may have heard that might is multiplicative, but that was only the case in the beta. So in short, for damage purposes, might isn't amazing and an easy stat to keep on the baseline values. Constitution. Constitution increases health, and like might, it increases the fortitude defense. It's a very straight up attribute and frankly the best attributes for pure tanking purposes. Because health has been simplified in comparison to the first game, it does count for more in that regard. Not a great stat, but it never hurts. Dexterity. Dexterity is one of the best stats in the game due to action speed being so incredibly important for any class that isn't meant to be a stationary, armored wall. Again, I'll refer back to my combat mechanics guide for more information regarding action speed, but suffice to say it's easily one of the biggest damage boosts you could get, and as such I would much sooner recommend dexterity over might if you're looking at dealing damage, weapon-based especially. For casters, I still think this wins out because even though you have limited resources, you'll still have enough for most fights and your weapon damage will still be solid. In the argument of burst damage versus sustained damage, dexterity still scales better, as it allows you to much quicker cycle through heavy hitting spells in quick succession. Just be wary that action speed increases do have diminishing returns, so if you're already planning on wearing light armor, dual wielding and using abilities such as Frenzy or Swift Strikes, then you aren't going to get nearly as much out of this. Perception. Perception is another very important stat for any character that isn't meant to be purely a blockade or does buffs and healing. Perception increases accuracy, which is of course your most important stat in actually hitting a target. Even though classes like a fighter or ranger already get plenty of accuracy increases, perception is still very good to get. And because stats like might are less effective, perception is going to work out a lot better in general. It doesn't scale as well as you level up, but because accuracy increases are rather difficult from gear and accuracy is so vital, in most cases I would certainly max perception. Intellect. The main increase intellect gives you is ability duration. It also increases area of effect, but the actual increase is rather small in most cases. Lastly, it also increases the will stat. For most characters, leaving intellect at the baseline 10 is more than enough to have good durations on abilities, but if you are relying on a lot of different buffs or solely on area of effect abilities, intellect is a good attribute to increase. Finally, resolve. Resolve is probably the least effective attribute for every character in Pillars of Eternity 2. For every point of resolve, your deflection is increased by 1 point. Deflection is your most important defense, but nevertheless the amount you get from resolve is incredibly tiny. At best, you are looking at about a 10 to 15% downscaling between 3 resolve and 10 resolve. Like perception, it doesn't scale, but unlike perception, the amount it gives you isn't a lot and there are other ways to get deflection. If you're looking for a tanking stat, definitely get more constitution than you would resolve. Additionally, it does decrease the amount of time for debuffs to stay on your character, but honestly most of these are rather few, and with the inspiration versus affliction mechanic, you have much better ways of dealing with this. And that's a global outline of the game's attributes. Of course, the actual attributes you are looking to take will vary from character to character, but in general, if you are making a damage dealer, I would prioritize perception followed by dexterity, followed by intellect or might, depending on whether you use self buffs at all. For a tank, I would prioritize dexterity followed by perception if you still want this tank to do damage, but if you simply don't care about whether he or she does damage and just want this character to stand in the way of enemies, then focus on constitution instead. Moving on to weapons and weapon proficiencies. First of all, in order to use a weapon, you don't need to be proficient in it. The only thing a proficiency gives you is the modal ability. It has no impact on your weapon's actual effectiveness. Most of these are extremely situational, and a lot of them aren't worth the payoff. Bad modal abilities are generally the ones that decrease your recovery speed. The Rapier's modal, for instance. Recovery speed decreases count more significantly than action speed increases do mathematically, making them very hard to balance out, resulting in a lot of lost damage over time. Windmill Slash, the Saber modal, is probably the only recovery loss modal worth it situationally because of the high penetration you can reach with sabers, and even then it takes a lot of consideration. For tanking, however, you have quite a few useful ones. The Spear modal increases your engagement slot by 1 for 15% less stride, which is combat movement, not a huge deal. The Dagger increases your melee deflection by 10 at the cost of 25% damage on the dagger attacks, not a big loss, especially for a tank, and the Hatchet incurs a 10 accuracy penalty on the target you hit at the cost of damage, but you can also quickly turn this modal off after debuffing your opponent, and as such is a very good modal to use. Not to mention these weapons baseline are very good for tanks. For range damage dealers, pistols and hunting bows offer viable constant modals. These take away accuracy for increased action speed, but if you have a lot of perception, which you should, and have buffs such as Ranger's Mark or Fighter's Self buffs, then you most likely get quite a lot out of these modals despite the accuracy penalties. Everything else is going to depend a lot on your party setup. Some of the more obvious ones that take away defenses for increased damage are of course going to be useful as long as you make sure that character is not going to get hit. Let's swing back to the actual classes. There are a lot of different ways to play these classes, and with the introduction of multiclassing there's so much more going on than before, and frankly I'm sure I haven't considered even half of the options yet. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you a very basic beginner's overview of what you can do. Let's begin with single classes versus multiclasses. Single classes are recommended by the game for beginning players, but in general do tend to fall behind on multiclassing if built properly. There are a number of exceptions, however. Casters in general perform really well as single classes, as they gain little out of multiclassing and benefit thoroughly from the increased power level. Wizards, priests, and druids as such are all excellent single classes. But there's also the notion of subclasses. For instance, the Ascendant Cipher is fantastic as a single class caster. Grouping them up very roughly, I would do the following. Single class works very well for a Berserker Barbarian, for a non-Scald Chanter, for the Ascendant Cipher, for a non-Shifter Druid, for any Monk, for any Priest, and for an Evocation or no subclass Wizard. That said, any Barbarians, any Chanters, and a no subclass Wizard make excellent multi-class characters as well. Anything else I didn't mention, I would recommend multiclassing over single classing, but let's get a little bit more specific and quickly look at the subclasses themselves. Barbarian. Berserker. Berserker is by far the highest damage dealer subclass of the Barbarian, if not any class, and can be built both single class and multi-class into an amazing high damage output character with a risky playstyle that requires a lot of micromanagement. In the case of single class, I'd focus on perception and intellect above anything else, and you want to focus a lot on making sure this class gets the kills to keep chaining Bloodlust for insane action speed and barbaric smash resets. This way your Barbarian will be very squishy and will require a lot of flanking and proper movement, but it pays off with insane damage output for both single target and area of effect. If you want to multiclass him, you will mainly be giving up Heart of Fury, but you can go with Fighter for a lot more durability and accuracy, allowing you to deal more consistent critical hits, or can go with Paladin for similarly more durability, especially Bleakwalkers works very well here. Then we get to Corpse Eater, which we'll quickly skip because they are frankly terrible due to their immense penalty of rage ability cost increase for a rather underwhelming bonus. Needless to say, I wouldn't recommend playing these. Likewise, I would not recommend playing Mage Slayer either, as they too have immensely bad downsides through spell resistance that will block allied spells, prevent potions and scrolls, and have all of your self buffs, including Frenzy, durations. What you could, however, consider is a no subclass Barbarian, which I personally am quite fond of for multiclass purposes, as they pair rather well with most martial classes to make solid frontline tanks or damage dealers. Just keep in mind that if you are making them sturdy Barbarians, you'll not fully benefit from their killing blow passives and skills. Chanter. Chanter are probably the most broken class in the game currently, as they grant insane buffs and if built as a summoner make most combat scenarios absolutely trivial. If you do want to build a summoner, Beckoner is the most obvious one, doubling your minions, but Troubadour also works. Troubadour gets brisk recitation, allowing you to use phrases quicker, but the best element is in fact the longer phrase Linger without brisk recitation, as this allows you to overlap 2 chants at any given time, making for an amazing support chanter buffing your party and your summons. If you want to make a Scald, I'd recommend pairing this with a Fighter, as Scald wants to do more crits, and Fighters, due to their disciplined barrage, are the most consistent way to go in order to keep doing more crits. In that case, you want to pick up Killer's Froze Stiff in order to paralyze enemies for more party-wide crits. Keeping in mind that this is a rather squishy class with no defensive benefits, even when pairing it with a Fighter. It's best making this a squishy damage dealer as opposed to a tank. Cipher. As I said, Ascendant Ciphers benefit a lot from single classing due to higher power levels, and in that case are excellent long-range casters. Beguilers are rather poor, and I would recommend skipping this, while Soul Blades most specifically work very well when multiclass with a Fighter or Barbarian in order to benefit from heavier area of effect damage through Cleave Stands or Carnage. Also make sure to pick up Phantom Foes in that case in order to throw down flanking on all the enemies you're about to hit with area of effect weapon damage. Druids. Druids, as I said, make for good single-class characters even though most of their heavy-hitting spells are front-loaded in the first 7 levels, which is what you get access to as multiclass. There isn't a lot of reason to multiclass the Animist Druids, as dual-caster multiclassing doesn't really work out, exception being Chanters, which work with everything. Fury is a curious one. It's not one I'd recommend for beginning players as it locks away some of your strongest spells, restoration spells, for relatively little gain. That said, if you know you won't necessarily need to rely on these and have another support character to back you up, you can certainly go this route. Life Giver is really strong but actually works out slightly better as a multiclass because the strongest level 8 and 9 abilities are all summons which are locked out on the Life Giver. As such, I'd recommend pairing them up with a Chanter or simply a Paladin or Fighter for extra durability. Shifter is then the go-to multiclass for druids. They don't care about their spells and care the least about intellect depending on the multiclass. Pairing these with any martial class, fighter, paladin, monk, barbarian, can work out very well. Keep in mind that the Devoted passive, which we'll see in a moment, doesn't work for shapeshift weaponry. Talking about Devoted, let's go to Fighter. Fighter is one of the best multiclass characters in the game, as they have so much to offer both offensively and defensively in almost all of their subclasses. Black Jacket is the most awkward one as it takes away your best defensive passive and is the only subclass I would recommend against using except when you're playing around with niche builds such as equipping your character with multiple firearms, and even then isn't great due to the blunted critical passive all firearms have. Devoted is arguably the best specialization for Fighter as it grants you a lot of benefits at the cost of only being able to use one type of weapon throughout the game. Devoted works as both tank and damage dealer extremely well. One thing to keep in mind is that fists also count as proficient weapons, so if you are looking to dual wield with a Devoted, which works for tanks and damage dealers, you can equip a weapon in the second slot, leaving the first slot open for a fist. Only do this though when you multiclass with a monk, as they are the only ones with proper scaling fist damage, but this combination is extremely competent. Unbroken is then the go-to tank subclass, but Devoted and no subclass work excellently as tanks as well. Unbroken notably gives you the best disengagement attacks in the game, which highly incentivizes enemies to stick around, while the negatives aren't very big. But in general, for all your fighter purposes, DPS or tank, Devoted is going to win out. Globally for fighters, you always want to get Disciplined Barrage and upgrade this to Disciplined Strikes, giving you one of the best damage buffs possible by converting 25% of your hits to crits. Stances, especially Cleave Stance, which is one of the biggest area of effect damage upgrades in the game, Charge, and their defensive abilities are all very good to use as well. Monks. Monks are extremely powerful when both multi-classed and single-classed. They have some incredibly strong late-game abilities, so single-classing a monk is a very good plan, and they are very self-sufficient through their buffs as damage dealers. Another big consideration for single-classing a monk is that fists scale with power level and therefore are better when single-classed. Like I said though, Devoted Fighter with a monk works very well for instance, even though your fists will skill less. Subclass-wise, Hellwalker is a very risky monk for relatively little gain. As I've mentioned during attributes, Might isn't actually that amazing, although Monk does get more out of it through their talents. Nevertheless, the downside is very huge and will result in a monk that will go down very fast. Shattered Pillar in general is the best and easiest pure damage dealing option to go with for no very significant downside. Nelpazka is also a very good subclass. If you're fine with relying on alchemy items, they are very strong indeed. In general, the only monk subclass I would avoid is Hellwalker, whereas all others adjust your playstyle. No subclass monks get the most out of the wound passives, Shattered Pillar avoids having to take damage to gain wounds and make for the best ability spam monks, and Nelpazka have a unique flavoring through their alchemy use that isn't too hard to manage to great effect. Paladin. Paladins make for great multiclasses and relatively poor single-classing as they don't get a lot in the final power levels. Paladins work with practically everything because they give an innate immense defensive boost to anyone, so even with casters, just multiclassing them into Paladins makes them very sturdy indeed. Subclass-wise, you'll want to look at Bleakwalkers first and foremost if you're looking to deal damage, because their Flames of Devotion, which itself is fantastic, will deal more corrode damage and inflict Sicken, which reduces constitution, meaning even less HP on enemies. Whereas Goldpack Knights and Shield Bearers are tempting options for tanking Paladins, though Paladins either need to wear shields and spears or multiclass into Fighter, Ranger or Barbarian in order to get enough engagement slots to be a real threat if you do want to make them a tank. In those cases, you probably don't need Goldpack Knight or Shield Bearer either. Kind Wayfarers are also a really good option if you want to be dual wielding, as their healing increase on Flames of Devotion will trigger twice for an immense self-heal and AoE party heal boost every time you use these. Darkosi Paladini, as such, are the only order I would stay clear of in its entirety. Priests make for excellent single-class characters offering the most support potential and should be single-class if you go Barath, Eothas, or Magran. Skane and Will do offer some multi-class potential. In particular, Skane works well with the fighter because of their summoned weapons, and Will offers some baseline defensive protection if you are looking to expand a support caster's arsenal, say a Life Giver Druid, while also picking up a little bit of defensive potential. Priest specifically is the only class where I would highly prioritize might over perception, resulting in their priorities being might, followed by dexterity, followed by intellect. Rangers are very poor single-class characters but work very well multi-classed. Ghostheart is a rough one because having to summon your pet for a bond is an immense downside. Even though the engagement immunity would be really tempting, it's not a terrible subclass, it just doesn't do a whole lot. Sharpshooter is obviously meant for ranged rangers, but the two best multi-classes, Rogue and Fighter, already take care of that hit to crit conversion, and the amount of penetration gained is merely 1, resulting in a massive recovery downside at the reward of very, very little. So if you are looking to make a ranged ranger, I'd be more inclined to recommend baseline ranger than sharpshooter. Stalker is the go-to melee ranger subclass, although with proper positioning works just fine at range as well, and one of my favorites and offers some very nice defensive capabilities for little downside, gaining them 1 armor and 5 deflection for both themselves and their pet, with the only stipulation being that their pet has to be within 7 meters, which isn't too hard to manage. So like I said, multiclass wise you're looking for fighter or especially rogue if you are doing ranged ranger, and you are looking at a fighter, paladin, barbarian, possibly monk if you are looking at a melee ranger, which can both be built towards tanking or damage dealing depending. Pet-wise, if you are looking for a sturdy companion, the boar, antelope, and bear are all very good options, whereas the wolf wins out from a damage perspective, followed closely by the lion. The antelope is essentially in between tanky and damage dealing. Talking about rogues have one saving grace when it comes to single classes, and that's Gambit, which theoretically offers unlimited resources. Outside of that though, they make excellent multi-classes as their resource management becomes rather tough, meaning the benefits of another class are very nice to have. For single classing, your only options are no subclass or assassin. Trickster is counter your goal with spending as little guile as possible to use on Gambit, and Street Fighter does not work as a single class rogue because it is inherently too squishy. No, in general, multi-classing is the way to go with rogues, offering a lot of damage potential through sneak attack especially, and works as both melee and ranged damage dealers with Fighter, Monk, Barbarian, Paladin, and Ranger. In the case of Fighter, you also have a compelling tank build through Street Fighter with persistent distraction and sneak attack damage on cleave stance. As a final note for Rogue, dual wielding works well for most of their abilities, but if you're planning to utilize backstab, extra damage from stealth, consider focusing on two-handed weapons as the backstab bonus is only applied on the first hit. And then finally we get to Wizards. Wizards make for good single class characters, especially with the Evoker and Transmuter subclass. In this case you get some really strong damage spells and quicker power levels where single classing is going to win out guaranteed. However, Wizards can also be built as magical frontline characters through Illusionist and Chanter, or no subclass especially. Illusionist and Enchanter both have a competent bonus, but no subclass offers the best access to the strongest spells in all 3 schools, which are very strong for this type of character, allowing you to use the great conjured weapons like Sitzal's Spirit Lance in addition to the defensive buffs. And with that, we've briefly gone over all of the basic classes, subclasses, and some strong multi-class options. Attribute-wise, if I didn't specifically point out anything, I'll refer back to the attributes section, and again, if some of the terminology confuses you, make sure to check out the Combat Mechanics Guide. With that said, thank you for watching, my name's been Haas, and I'll see you in the next video or livestream.